Sorry for the technical glitch, both for you and for our viewers. But I'm sure the 7-minute wait will be worth it all. So yeah, welcome everyone. I'm just looking at the numbers rolling in. People are coming. Thank you everyone for being here again for another of our monthly Hizmet Reads book club live sessions. I hope you've been able to read the article of this month, which was actually a book chapter co-authored by Dr Ozcan Keles, who is with us today. Dr Keles is an academic who holds a PhD in the production of Islamic knowledge and human rights. He's also a chair of our London-based Dialogue Society and a non-practicing barrister, which is, I'm sure, an entirely unique bio to hold. We are here to be discussing the book chapter titled Tackling the Twin Threats of Islamophobia and Puritanical Islamist Extremism, case study of the Hizmet Movement. And we discussed with you, Dr Keles, the article before, and it has a lot of kind of personal reasons, actually, the story behind why you wrote it and how it evolved. So perhaps before going into the article and going into the jargon and discourse and then the criticism or perhaps limitations of the movement, would you just like to share with us, why you wrote this article, how it came to being, and your motivation and inspiration behind it?
Sure. Thank you, Aisha, and thank you for having me on this video Instagram chat, and apologies to the people that have joined and for the late start. You're right. So this chapter originates from a paper that I originally wrote in 2009 called De-radicalisation by Default, a dialogue approach to rooting out violent extremism. And that paper in itself was rooted in my personal experience from when I was a child. So I was born and raised in London. I went to a primary school here, St. Michael's at Bow School. At the age of 11, when I graduated from primary school, my parents took me to Turkey, and the aim was for me to learn the Turkish language and culture and a bit of the religion as well, so that I wouldn't, in inverted commas, lose my identity. So they enrolled me in a school that turns out to be Hizmet's first school that was founded anywhere in the world. So this was Yamanlar Koleji. My parents didn't know anything about the school, and neither did I, or the background to it. We knew, or people had said, so this is a school that's founded by Fethullah Gülen, but we knew perhaps that he was an Islamic scholar, but nothing further than that, really. I didn't really enjoy my time there. So this was a boarding school. It was very didactic. The learning was very regimented. It's very disciplined, and that didn't sort of fit with my free spirit, if you like. So I returned sort of 2-3 years later, at the age of 13. I went to a state comprehensive school here. It's a mixed school. And when I went into that school, obviously the learning environment is very different. It's very relaxed, self-confident. I remember going into the art lesson with there being different sized tables, and there was music playing in the background, and people just getting on with their learning. And I remember that affecting me as a child. So what I saw here, I associated with democracy, with the culture of the West, and with Christianity. So I associated that, what I was seeing in the classroom, and I associated the didactic, the formulaic, the sort of rote learning of the school that I went to in Turkey with Islam and Turkishness. And I felt uncomfortable with the fact that what I was seeing here was appealing to me. And so I went through this identity crisis. Can I really like this? Can I see democracy in Islam? And if not, how can this appeal to me? And if it is appealing to me, then perhaps I'm not a good Muslim. So I went through this identity crisis. I became really defensive. I became dogmatic. I became very argumentative. I remember staying behind almost all of my lessons and giving my teachers a really hard time. I remember staying behind the biology lesson and arguing the Darwinian philosophy with my biology teacher, or staying behind my English language lessons and arguing, the merits of belief in afterlife with her. And with numerous other teachers and so forth. There was a Bosnian war that was happening at the time that deeply affected me, caused resentment and anger, and a sense of wanting to do something, a sense of having this mission. I started to take, for example, I would argue with there was at the time I thought they were PKK supporters. Who knows? But I took it upon myself to try to convert them to Sunni Islam. not that I know that they were not a part of that, but that was what I took myself to do. I remember taking an Alevi student for 2 years to the Jummah prayer. So we used to skip lesson legitimately because I had a legitimate case for doing so, but I used to take him along. And I remember 2 years afterwards, 2 years later, his parents found out and said, "We're Alevi, you know, what's happening here? Why is my son missing this lesson?" But it was me, I was doing that. So I would go into the library at Wood Green and I would take out Christian books and Bibles and scribble in the margins, you know, why this was wrong and false and so forth. You know, so that was my sort of mindset. I was unsatisfied with my parents' Islam because it was traditional, folkloric. It didn't answer the questions that I had. And, you know, it just became very relentless in my sort of activism. That's when I sort of connected with Hizmet's teachings, if you like. I went back to Turkey. I remember purchasing almost all of them that were available, the Risale-i Nur books that were authored by the famous 20th century Islamic theologian Said Nursi. I remember, you know, purchasing Gülen's books, his audio tapes. I remember going to White Hart Lane School at the age of 14 in the morning, listening to Gülen and, you know, his Kabe Baskına, you know, sermon, which is, you know, so emotional and so forth. But I remember doing that and reconnecting with Hizmet people in Turkey and thereby somehow connecting the teachings with some of the practices that I saw. Although I didn't enjoy the school, I enjoyed the company of the mentors and the belletmens, as they're referred to, the dorm masters. And also there were senior students in the school that took time out of their, you know, out of what they were doing to sort of support me and mentor me. So I started to connect the teachings with that practice. And the substance of that teachings, Aisha, was quite important. So there's a focus of this on the centrality of love and compassion in Hizmet. You know, Gülen makes this emphasis on Sufi love and compassion a lot. He would teach that Islam is not politics, and that we shouldn't reduce it to politics. That Nursi had this really interesting teaching. The West is not necessarily bad. Muslims are not necessarily good. What matters, what makes us good and bad, are not the things that we identify ourselves by, but our characteristics and our behaviors and our actions. You know, so it complexifies my notion of us and them. The immense social responsibility. So there was no backing off from that. Islam and Islamic literature speaks about this a lot, and you see this sort of amplified, if you like, in the teachings of Nursi and Gülen. Positive action, musbet hareket, you know, whatever you do should be positive and should be proactive rather than reactive. This focus on temsil over tebliğ, for example, that we should internalize Islamic teachings to the point that it becomes an inadvertent overspill, that we're not trying to teach people anything, we're simply trying to internalize and live the Islamic values. And in doing so, it becomes an inadvertent overspill, as opposed to tebliğ, which is the proselytism, the missionization, the sermonizing of Islamic teaching. So, you know, the emphasis was on the former as opposed to the latter. Another important teaching that came out of Nursi and Gülen was that pluralism was God intended, you know, so that we can't make everything one and the same. That we should emphasize dialogue over debate, and hope and husn zan were big teachings, you know, that there is hope in this life and in the hereafter, and that we should focus on husn zan, which is seeing people in the best positive light that there is. And we should try to focus on fixing and changing the near as opposed to the afar. You know, if you look at this Islamist literature, there's a focus on the afar, things that are happening outside of our ability of control. Whereas in the literature in Hizmet, it was always about bringing everything back to what you can do within your family, within your community, here and now. And, you know, these are sort of, I've sort of tried to give you sort of general ideas of what the teachings were, but one of them, just to give you a more concrete one, Gülen in, I think it was 1994, said there can be no return from democracy. Democracy is not perfect, but it is the best form of governance that we have, and it is a requirement on all Muslims to engage in democracy. And I can't tell you how significant that was for me as a 14, 15-year-old. It sort of melted the bricks from my mind. Or when in 1995, Gülen said, as a traditional Islamic preacher, he said, there are two people that I regret most of having not met. One of them is Aziz Nesin, Turkey's foremost critical atheist thinker, and the other is Zeki Müren. According to the BBC, Zeki Müren is a cross-dressing Turkish classical music singing homosexual. And, you know, for somebody of Gülen's characteristics to say that was significant then, and I still would still be significant for somebody of similar disposition and popularity to say now. And so for me, that helped me to mellow down. It was a form of cognitive liberation, and it meant that I could now acknowledge that I can be a Muslim, a Democrat, Turkish, British, and that I didn't need to choose between these various identifiers. Now, the significance of this is that when this happened, So this was about 13, 14, 15. When I was 16, I was sitting my GCSE exams at State Comprehensive School. This teacher started. His name was Mr. Khan. I don't think that identifies him. It is quite a popular surname. He was a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, and he started at the State Comprehensive. And he was very sporty, very articulate, knew his material well, sort of a amateur bodybuilder, and religious. And he invited me to off-campus, off-school events. So I went to Hizb ut-Tahrir Bosnia March. I went to an event at one of the mosques where there was a Hizb ut-Tahrir event, and it was very clear he was trying to recruit me. And we had this climactic sort of situation where one day he said to me, "Can you lead the Jummah prayers in school?" Which he started. And I said, "Sure, I'll lead the Jummah prayers." And I led the Jummah prayer. My sermon was this: Islam is not politics, and we can't reduce Islam to politics. And if we do, we do a great disservice to Islam and to politics. And at the end, he said, "Ozcan, you said some really dodgy stuff. That was really wrong." And that was sort of how we parted our ways, if you like. But when I reflect on that moment, and I often do in the context of this discussion, I say, well, if that person had come a year or so earlier, when I was going through my identity crisis, when I was angry, when I was looking for direction, when I was looking for simplicity, when I was already approaching a sort of dichotomous worldview of us versus them, this rhetoric, this logic, this representation that he provided would have been, well, I would have lapped it up. It would have appealed to me, and it would have given me a form of false clarity, if you like. And I would have spent 5-10 years wasting my life within Hizb ut-Tahrir, if you like. And so for me, when we in the context of this discussion, I always, when we talk about countering violent extremism, the emphasis is often on counter-extremism groups, or it's on linear projects, let's say. And what I mean by that are projects that aim to tackle violent extremist ideology head on. And this is in part, especially in the UK context, because of PREVENT. Now, for the viewers that may not know what PREVENT is, in the UK, we have a counter-extremism or counter-terrorism strategy called CONTEST. It comprises 4 Ps: prevent, protect, pursue, and prepare. And the prevent aspect of this is about preventing radicalization to begin with, or de-radicalizing people that have become radicalized, so that we prevent the attacks from happening. And in 2008, the first objective of PREVENT during the Labour government was to tackle violent extremist ideology head on. So this is the kind of linear approach that I'm talking about. And the problem with this is it's unclear how to do it. It's reactive because you're reacting to an agenda that somebody else has set. It intellectualizes ideology, whereas ideology is in fact more impactful when it's part and parcel of a package of practice. And it sort of takes ideology and sort of considers it to be a discursive thing that has effect at the discursive level. It feeds a martyrdom complex of the people that they were trying to defeat. And of course, government-backed projects that try to do this, whether it's linear or otherwise, they're counterproductive because they don't have legitimacy. So the paper that we're talking about here is rooted in an idea of drawing attention to an indirect approach. So what we're saying is, look, yes, there will be direct approaches, and that's fine. Carry on doing that, or let's rethink that as well. But we also need to be aware of the indirect, the non-linear approach. And the non-linear approach comes out of the social movement practices of Islamic movements, such as Hizmet, not just Hizmet, but such as Hizmet, and the things that they do on an everyday basis. Now, these movements, they don't take countering violent extremism as an objective. That's not what they set out to do. But nonetheless, they can produce that outcome unknowingly and through activities that don't have a bearing to countering extremism. But it's really important that we see that, because we need as much help as we can within the context of countering violent extremism, but also because they are dealing with it, preventing radicalization from happening in the first place. So if you look at the de-radicalisation project, the de-radicalisation project is about targeting people that have become radicalized. Statistically, there's far fewer people that are radicalized than those that are not. Okay, so the vast majority of Muslims are not radicalized. So we need to be exerting our efforts on understanding how we can prevent them from being radicalized. And this is where social movements, Islamic social movements, play a role. Some of these Islamic social movements, all of them are doing things, and the things that they're doing can either be helping this process or hindering this process. And so this paper is about drawing attention to that in the context of Hizmet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I had heard part of your story before, but I didn't know it was this let's just say. I mean, I have my own, but it's not half as interesting, and I thought my one was interesting. I'm sure there are many more to hear.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been asked a question about, why we're here. So for those who have just perhaps joined in and weren't aware of the book club, we're here to discuss an article written by Dr. Keles regarding Islamist extremism and the threat of both that and Islamophobia and the
with co-authors.
Yeah.
Not.
With Dr. Ismail Mr. Sezgin and Professor Ihsan Yilmaz as well as co-authors in the paper. So we've kind of had an introduction onto the motivations behind it, this kind of story behind it, and what shaped perhaps the article for those that have read it. I mean, there are some terms that are coming up that I think we could just explain in quite briefly as we begin to dive into the debates around and raised within the article. So there's a lot of kind of reference to something hijacking Islam, this Islamist ideology hijacking Islam that is a modern phenomena.
Yeah.
And the authors refer to this with Khalid Abu al-Fadl's reference to Puritanism. This kind of very strict understanding of Islam, that there is some kind of pure Islam, there is a one understanding of Islam, and that others are false. And through this strict understanding, there are also politicized elements on how perhaps the state should be run. Perhaps within this understanding, of course, that which defines it is the Sharia or fiqh, for example. But as Dr. Keles, a specialist in this, I'm sure you know better than I that fiqh is something written by man. It's not necessarily divine law by God. However, strict understandings within this, and this has kind of evolved into Islamist extremism, fundamentalism, and unfortunately terror. Not only terror, I mean, we have examples of the Taliban, but we also have examples of, for example, the Islamic Republic of Iran. So there are various manifestations of Islamism in society.
Yeah.
And then, we go on to the definition of Islamophobia, and in the UK, there's increasing debate and defining Islamophobia as a form of racism. Markers of Muslims, perhaps headscarf, perhaps dress, perhaps a beard, or perhaps even one's name, can lead to, discrimination in perhaps the most mediocre sense, but, further forms of violence and oppression as well, popularized by perhaps the far right, we could say, in a Western context. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the Hizmet movement in regards to these? I would just kind of start the debate in the article. So Professor Ihsan Yilmaz touches upon, some form of a theological deprivation within Islam, perhaps as a result of colonialism. The article doesn't kind of go into the reasons of this. But the ulama, the Islamic scholars in Muslim world, Muslim society, are lacking some sort of touch with modernity. And within this, we're talking about, the popular ulama, for example, rather than the Islamists who have their own idea of how to address issues within modernity. Ihsan Yilmaz says that, within this theological deprivation, within this space, Gülen provides an example and an illustration of, firstly, a theological understanding, and Dr. Keles touched upon it, understanding of diversity in society, and the fact that if God wanted, everyone would have been the same. But, there are Quranic verses which, state that, if God wanted to, they would have, and clearly he didn't, and that's why there is this divinely intended diversity within society. This is just one example of several theological understandings that Gülen brings in. Gülen brings in Kalbin Zümrüt Tepeleri, Emerald Hearts?
The Emerald Hills of the Heart.
Emerald Hills of the Heart. Several theological and Sufi understandings within back into Islamic discourse, and these kind of understandings were perhaps alienated or seen as being against Islam by Islamists. You know, this connection of the heart, the mind, into understanding some form of modernity. So Gülen does this, but this theological understanding.
Perhaps just to clarify there, so the chapter that we've written is actually a combination of two different papers that we published previously. So the second half, or the main bulk of the chapter, if you like, is focused on Hizmet's practice in relation to violent extremism, and how Hizmet's practice undermines violent extremism as a byproduct of what it is doing. So it's not aiming to undermine violent extremism. It aims to please and attain the pleasure of God through activities in education and dialogue and community-based activities. But that these activities as a byproduct undermine violent extremist ideology, propensity, and the characteristics and elements that can enable violent extremism. So that's the second part, which relates to the story that I told earlier. So the sort of the earlier part of the chapter, as you rightly point out, originates from a paper that Islam was published previously, which is where he spoke about these issues about Islamophobia and the theological deprivation that you've mentioned.
And just to kind of nicely follow on from what you've said, within this theological understanding, Ihsan Yilmaz points us to an understanding that Gülen makes. He doesn't believe in this kind of Darul Islam, Darul Harb, so an abode of Islam, an abode of war, that the world is somehow in conflict at all times. But Gülen believes in an understanding of Darul Hizmet, an abode or a world of service, and this has no borders. That's why Gülen calls upon those motivated by him or his followers, perhaps you could say, to engage in some sort of a hijrat, migration as well.
Darul Harb, Darul Islam, these are not necessarily they're not in the Quran. The Hadith, these are the conceptualizations of the pre-modern jurists that followed. And so, I mean, you made a point earlier about fiqh being a product of the jurists, you know, that's their interpretation. Abdul Kerim Surush and others, and I would certainly subscribe to that view, suggest that that's not just the case. That there is religion, which is divine, which is holy, which is unchanging, which is infallible. But everything we know about religion, everything, not just Islamic law, but everything that we know about theology and mysticism and the metaphysical dimensions and the ethical dimensions of Islam, everything we know about religion is in fact religious knowledge. And therefore it's open to change, it's fallible, it's flawed. So it's a bit like, where we know something about the atoms, don't we, in physics, and we think that it's the smallest particle, and then we discover the atoms. Now, then we think, okay, the atom is the smallest particle. Then we discover that the atoms comprise neutrons and electrons. Then we think, okay, that's the smallest particle. And then we discover something called quarks and quantum physics, which blows our mind, right? So what's changed? Did the atom change? Did the smallest particle in the universe ever change? No, it was always there. Our knowledge in relation to it developed, and our knowledge about it has changed. And so Abdul Kerim Surush makes this point that everything about religion, everything we know about religion, including the representation of the Quranic text that we have in our mind as and when we're reading it, is in fact a form of interpretation. And so therefore it is limited by our limitedness. It is flawed because we are flawed in the way that we are as human beings. And so everything about Islamic knowledge is in fact human, and therefore change, and therefore it's open to development. Yeah, so that sort of, if you like, expands what we mean by that.
And I think that, understanding of humans being able to understand more and more about knowledge itself is one thing, but there's also a thing which is kind of innately within Islamic knowledge production, which again is your PhD area, so I won't touch too much and hopefully not make a mistake. But concepts such as muamalat, what is the best for society, for example, that changes as time changes. So perhaps we can revise what we thought was perhaps true in its time, and perhaps we need to contextualize them and bring things into a new understanding based on the time itself. Also,
there's conscious knowledge production and production, and I'm actually more interested in the latter as opposed to the former. But, I mean, this is a huge topic that we need.
Yeah, perhaps we may need to clarify for our viewers that, you know, Gulen never says, you know, I'm doing such reformations to Islamic law. I think that's a sphere and a space and a line that he stays very far from. He does it with his discourse, he does it with his theologizations, he does it with his actions and with perhaps projects that he's envisioned, but he never actually clearly states this, which is perhaps to avoid controversy. Perhaps it's due to his own humbleness as Islamic cleric, but
sure. Sure, but it's also to do with, so we often think about the head leading the body, right? Mm-hmm. And we do it down here. And, you know, when you think about the movement, you think about the leader, and the leader is leading the movement. So what if it's the other way around? What if it's the fact leading the leader? Or what if it's that the movement is making a substantial contribution to the production of the ideas and thoughts of the leader? Okay. That's where things become start to really become interesting, because we look at the mouthpiece and we associate the sound with the mouth and the mouth with the person. We say that's where it's coming from. I'm hearing it from here, therefore it must originate from here. Whereas actually there's something far more complex going on. And once you start to understand that, you start to appreciate that it's not in fact the way that we think it is. And even if the actors, they may think it that way, it's not necessarily and we, you know, it's possible, and this is what I look at in my thesis. It's possible to demonstrate this. It's possible to demonstrate, in fact, that it's not about what we're thinking up here necessarily, but what we're thinking through our everyday practices. But as I say, that sort of opens us up to a sort of a broader discussion. But can I, Aisha, if you don't mind, just comment to you about you know, radicalization and how social movement practice sort of prevents it at the outset. And in terms of analyzing the story that I told you, one of the things that would help us to understand is called the anchoring effect in psychology. So the anchoring effect tells us this, that when you learn something for the first time and you internalize that knowledge, you accept that as correct, as truthful, and you then subsequently judge knowledge that you later on encounter in its ability to cohere with the knowledge that you've already internalized. So if you learn something for the first time, you accept it as correct, as truthful, and then subsequent knowledge is either accepted or rejected on the basis of whether or not it matches the previous knowledge that you learned. So, and this, you could also explain that by cognitive dissonance, that as human beings, we like to keep our minds coherent. So we can't internalize two conflictual beliefs and views. And if we have one, and then we encounter another, we have to reject one or the other. So that says a similar thing. And the reason why I'm saying this is important here is because it helps us to understand what I've just explained to you in terms of the story. Because I encountered the practice and the teachings of Hizmet before I encountered the practice and teachings of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And so that allowed me, so I took the first encounter to be truthful and genuine, and the subsequent encounter to be incorrect insofar as it contradicted with that one. So this is how we understand it. Now, whether or not Hizmet's representation of Islam vis-a-vis Hizb ut-Tahrir's representation of Islam is truthful and more correct and more authentic or not is another debate. I mean, we can debate this, and you know, there's a certain level of speculation, but that's not the point I'm making. The point I'm making is that social movements, Islamic social movements that are widespread in society, one of the things they do is that they encounter people at a young age. They provide them with the means of learning about Islam through a certain form of practice. And that provides them with an anchoring effect. So whatever comes later, it brushes against that and is either falls by the wayside or is accepted. So that's why I think, you know, they play a sort of an important role there. And that's the point that we're making in the de-radicalisation paper in 2009, when Labour government came up with this, let's tackle ideology head on. What we were saying is that, in fact, you know, look, there are problems with this, which I said at the beginning. But rather there's a project, there's a way to do this which is in fact more proactive. So if we understand Islam, the authentic notion of Islam, or we attempt to popularize the authentic version of Islam, which celebrates diversity, pluralism, and is more dialogic, then that is in itself excludes a notion of Islam that is violent, that is that otherizes other people, that is, that divides rather than brings people together. So the stronger the former becomes, the weaker the latter becomes. Now, this is an approach that the FCO, the Foreign Commonwealth Office of this country, has, I think, now recently adopted. In 2016, they organized a conference and have been organizing a series of events where they have found an inverse correlation between freedom of religion or belief and violent extremist ideology and propensity. So they say that within a given polity, if there is more freedom of religion or belief, the propensity for violent extremism, claiming an Islamic justification, is less. Right? So there's an indirect correlation. So rather than try to tackle the violent extremist ideology head on for the reasons I've explained, what they talk about is they aim to strengthen the atmosphere for the protection of freedom of religion or belief, and that's what they believe is to be the case. So this is what sort of comes out. But what I think is also important in the context of Hizmet is that it's not just the teachings that it provides, and this applies not just for Hizmet, but of course broader Islamic social movements more generally. But it's also the purpose they provide. They feed the need to be doing something purposeful with your life. They provide solidarity. So solidarity is a key thing, right? To be in a collectivity of people, and we see that today in the development of various social cause, social movements. So Islamic movements, in fact, do this. It provides a roadmap. So how do you take your energy? How do you optimize it, and how do you put it into practice? But there's also other things, and two I just mentioned, if I may. One of them is upward social mobility. So Hizmet and other movements similar to it, they invest a lot on formal and informal education, migration, connection with other people, and all of these things help towards upward social mobility, and that helps you to become better agents of change, right? And so that strengthens your ability to believe that you can change yourself and your environment, which of course counters the argument or goes against the idea that we're somehow helpless and that things can't be changed. And the other one is cognitive compromise. Hizmet promotes sustained social interaction with the other. And when you're engaged in social interaction with the other, there's something called cognitive compromise, or the relativization of your own ideas, the moderation of your own ideas. And this happens at the subconscious level. So you're not even aware about it, but you're mutually relativizing each other's ideas by simply engaging in sustained social interaction with the other. And this helps to complexify your view about other people and also your view about yourself. And the complexification works against the dichotomous worldview that violent extremists promote. The black and white, the 0-1 sum game. The complexification sort of undermines that. Yeah, so I'm just going to open the window if you don't mind. Sorry.
Yeah, for those who are not from the UK, we're having
heat wave.
Heat wave. I don't know if I was going to say heat wave if it is the one, but we're not used to it. So we're both struggling here. No, but I mean, just kind of on that complication of defining against the kind of black and white, that's something that isn't unique to Gülen himself. It's something that Said Nursi kind of begins to theologize, but Gülen is the one who within that strain of thought brings it more into action, first in Turkey with inviting of the Pope, interactions with Alevi communities as well, and then something that later turns into dialogue centers throughout the world. But for Said Nursi, for example, he talks about Muslim values or attributes that perhaps someone who may identify as a Muslim may not carry, and someone who doesn't identify as a Muslim may carry. So there's a complication with or with the identity itself in a positive way. It allows one to see things in a much more nuanced understanding. But on the concept of Gülen's kind of theolization of a Dar al-Hizmet, I mean, within the modern, we do have kind of other examples of this by modern thinkers as well. And, just to kind of bring in a couple more concepts such as Temsil versus Tebliğ, which we've touched upon but haven't gone into detail yet. Someone like Professor Tariq Ramadan, for example, mentions the Dar al-Shahada. I mean, again, he's against this dichotomy of a Darul Islam, Darul Harb, but for where Gülen says there is a Darul Hizmet, there is a role of Temsil. Someone like Tariq Ramadan says, there is a Darul Shahadat, and within this, Tariq Ramadan is again for interreligious dialogue. He is for, many of the things that the Hizmet movement is engaging with, but for him, this is a method, and within his kind of strain of thought, this is a method used by Salafist reformers, perhaps, as tabli, to kind of explain Islam, perhaps encourage others to convert to Islam. But this is different from Gülen's understanding of Temsil, which is more involved in building those bridges between different faiths, different cultures, perhaps correcting a misinterpretation of Islam, which is prominent in the West, but it doesn't force or inspire to kind of convert the other.
It's the emphasis on Temsil over Tabligh. So Tabligh is about preaching and sermonizing to other people, and this idea that as Muslims we need to sermonize to everyone else. So by emphasizing Temsil over Tabligh, automatically he sort of removes that obligation to just be religiously righteous to everyone. Okay. And that obviously supports his view about pluralism, that the pluralism is not just a default outcome, it is an actively created outcome. So it's not that God could have created us all one people and one religion, but that he created us knowingly and willingly as people of multiple tribes and cultures and colors and backgrounds and faiths. So this idea that God is constantly creating us, his sunnatullah, he's constantly recreating the plurality of society. So that's not just a default outcome by not doing the other. This is a choice. But the concept of Temsil, of course, is quite fundamental, and it's about saying internalize the values and the teachings that you think that you want to preach. Internalize it. Don't preach it. Don't ever preach it. Internalize it, live it, make it a part of the fabric of your very being. So that what? So that others can see? No, because if you are internalizing, so let's imagine you pray for the intention of demonstrating how prayer should be done to the poor people who don't know how to pray. That's still Tabligh. That's still preaching through action. Temsil is the inadvertent overspill of internalized practice, of internalized values. It's something you're not trying to show, but shows nonetheless. Okay, so and it's actually really important because our practices change us in ways that we don't recognize. Okay, so you can't sermonize, you can't preach it because it's not a cognitive thing. It's something that you need to internalize and practice, and that internalization of those values and those teachings will change you and change your understanding of those values. Right? So we put far too much emphasis on preaching, including in the context of Gülen. So Gülen said, let's engage in dialogue in 1994. Okay. Then what did he do? He engaged in dialogue. Okay. So in 1995, he met 90 journalists. How many did he meet in 93? None that we know of. So you go from no meetings with other people to meeting 90 writers and journalists in 1994. And then subsequently, he gave an interview, I think, to the Atlantic, where they say, yeah, you used to say things that appeared to be anti-Semitic in the past, in your sermons in the 1970s and 80s. You seem to have changed those views. What happened? And he says, I engaged in dialogue with Christians and Jews. And in doing so, I came to realize that my interpretation of the Quranic verses concerning them were misguided and misplaced, that this was about characteristics and it wasn't about the wholesale Christians and Jews themselves. But when did he change that? After he engaged in dialogue, not after he preached about engaging in dialogue. So the practice of doing the things that we're talking about are quite key here. And that in fact is why we can't preach these things in a genuine way, because we don't know which way they're going to go and how they're going to develop. And so it's all about, being active socially, but internalizing these values within yourself.
I mean, and as people who are involved with the UK-based Dialogue Society, I think there's something that we can recognize is, sometimes you're trying to encourage people and your volunteers to engage in dialogue, but that can only go so far. It's when people, even if they do one dialogue activity, they can recognize for their own purpose and their own self, the significance of engaging with, the other, and then that overspills itself. They then become, active dialogue volunteers. But you know, just to kind of confirm what you said, you know, I think that's something that we see in practice with everyday individuals of the movement as well. But
I'm having a BBC interview moment where my children are sort of trying to get in. So do you just...
You don't have to, there's no need for someone to kind of come behind and...
No, it's... I don't know. I'm just going to let them out because I want to open this door at the same time. Just give me... Is that all right? 30 seconds.
Okay.
Sorry.
Of course. And kind of remind viewers, if you have any questions, we're coming towards our question time. We did begin 10 minutes late. We're just going to discuss the actions which came from the theologization and kind of philosophy that we've discussed, and then perhaps his mislimitation.
Sorry, I'm back.
I just said that, you know, if anyone had any questions, they can start typing. We're kind of coming to get into the actions of the movement and how this discourse will transform from mere discourse to action and change within society. So, you know, in the Turkish context, and this is something that I know we'll bring up again when we talk about the limitations of the movement, but in the Turkish context, you know, in a society where perhaps there was a need for schools. Gülen says, you know, that we should not open more mosques, we should open more schools. And you know, and later on, you know, support in the opening of Alevi worship places, for example, and joint cultural centers, and building, you know, both an academic and dialogue opportunity within the Turkish context where these things were limited. And for this, he did receive criticism from more Islamist or right-wing thinking individuals.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there's a focus on dialogue, on education, grassroots religious dialogue activism, which in the article you've kind of referred to UK examples. So we've got example of MentorWise, which is providing the mentoring services that you kind of mentioned you had in your time at the Gülen affiliated school in Turkey. You have Sohbet Society, which is organizing kind of local religious support groups, both providing a sohbet, you know, a circle, and other means of you know, bringing people together and keeping that Islamic grassroots spirit alive. And within this, you mentioned, and I think I was going to say it earlier on, but it's crossed my mind at the moment, that you know, within the Gülen discourse, there's an emphasis on living for Islam rather than dying for Islam, which is in the Islamist discourse. So to become a martyr, both in Gülen's discourse and in Islamist discourse is significant. But how you do that, rather than dying for your faith, you do it by living until the very last moment of your life for your faith. And within that understanding, it is living for service and living for the other, in which one then comes to know themselves.
But that's partly because there are no shortcuts in Islam. I mean, you don't die if you haven't really lived for Islam. Okay, you can't live a life of sin and then decide to take your life, in inverted commas, in a cause that you believe Islamic, and then enjoy all the pleasures that you think will come your way as a result of doing that. Those shortcuts don't work. I mean, people can be forgiven. God is all merciful. Who knows God will forgive and who will, you know, face the justice of God. You know, all of that is open. I don't dare to provide any limitations on that. But the idea that we can just live a normal life or live a life of self-indulgence and then consciously go and commit acts of violence in which we risk our own lives and therefore somehow die for Islam, it's a fallacy in the Islam. And in the tradition, in the inherited tradition of Islamic knowledge. And I want to point this out because, you know, I said earlier that what is Islam and what is Islamic, what is not Islam, this can be debated, and certainly there are different interpretations. And I said, you know, if Muslims believe that Islam is dialogic, that it celebrates diversity, that it celebrates good relations with our neighbors, integration within society, that popularizing this further acts as an anchoring point that protects us against radicalization. So I said, and I stand by that. But this question of what is and what is not Islamic, and what I wanted to say here is this is not just completely relative, because some people get think that, you know, this is entirely relative, that there can be a group of Muslims that say an X, another group of Muslims that say Y. And so this is all open to, you know, a debate and discussion, and it's entirely relative. Everyone can say what they want. That's not a problem. But if you take Islam for a moment, and let's just desacralize it, let's just take divinity out of it for a moment. What you're left with is an inherited body of knowledge, an inherited body of knowledge that is religious in nature, that is metaphysical in nature, that goes back 14 centuries. That inherited body of knowledge has a plot, it has certain themes, it has certain characteristics, it has a mechanism by which it identifies how it should renew itself, okay? Now, you can operate within the parameters of that. You can operate outside of the parameters of that, but some things will be within the parameters of that inherited body of Islamic knowledge. Some things will be outside of it. And a good example in practical theology by somebody whose name I can't remember now, he talks about the Shakespearean play of King Lear. And he says, you know, you could take King Lear and you could provide it with a modern interpretation, no problems. And many people do. Many theaters do. But the story of King Lear has a basic plot, it has basic themes, it has characters. If you go so far outside of that, you will produce something that is unrecognizable, and you will be considered to have lost the plot because what you're producing is something else. Okay, so similarly, within the inherited body of Islamic knowledge, there are certain things, as I already said, these are human constructs, but nonetheless they are inherited and they are part of the tradition of Islamic knowledge. We can critique them, we can say we don't like them, we can say that needs to change. You know, Tariq Ramadan, you mentioned earlier, he and others, of course, call for an ijtihad on ijtihad. Ijtihad is a form of Islamic reinterpretation. He says it's insufficient to provide us with the types of scriptural reinterpretations that will provide, you know, certain conformity or bring us the type of renewal that we need. So we need an ijtihad on ijtihad. Or ijma is one of the methods by which we arrive at Islamic law. It's one of the principles of usul al-fiqh. But there wasn't ijma. This is consensus, heuristic consensus on the concept of ijma. So, you know, where did we get this idea that ijma is one of the methods by which we can produce Islamic law, right? So there are four methods: the Quran, Sunnah, Qiyas, comparison, and then ijma, juristic consensus, or the consensus of the Ummah. But there wasn't consensus on that particular source, right? So these are, of course, matters open to discussion. But this was nonetheless, there's a matrix, there's a scaffold to this structure. And so therefore the things that we say, some of them will be entirely outside of it, and therefore we will struggle in claiming legitimacy, right, to the body of knowledge that we're trying to relate to. So, you know, I think it's important to make that point. So some things will be more authentic insofar as they appear to be more connected to the theme and the structures that this body of knowledge provides us with.
I mean, and I think that's why we're here with the discussion and the topic of the article that you co-authored, because there are organizations, you know, Islamist organizations, terrorist organizations, perhaps we should call them, who have a different version of what is inherently Islamic. But when you look at the discourse, for example, if you look at bin Laden's justification for 9/11, which he published after the attacks, none of the reasons are Islamic. I mean, you know, the reasons are: you bombed our children here, you bombed our children there, your capitalism has done this, your moral ethnic code in your country has done this, and you're in a backward society. I mean, even bin Laden's justification for his act of terror is not and he, you know, struggles to legitimize this amongst the large number of Muslim ulama who criticize him and say, you know, this is not Islam, and the majority of Muslims around the world, you know, perhaps we can say 99.9% of Muslims in the world who will say this is not Islam, and you have him on the other hand trying to justify himself, but perhaps, you know, just you know, name dropping a verse here or there, but no context or no Islamic knowledge production behind it. So I think that's why what you've said is relevant and critical. Just wary of the time.
We get on limitations.
Let's get limitations. They're the last set of notes in my hand. So I'll kind of summarize them as a whole, and then if there are any you want to pick at and expand. So, you know, the limitations of the Hizmet movement in targeting indirectly perhaps Islamism and Islamophobia, both two sides of radicalization. A limitation of the movement is perhaps within its roots in Kemalist Turkey, and therefore its understanding, perhaps its Turkification of Islam and a necessity to do so. Its kind of attempt and efforts to avoid controversy, to avoid confrontation. Its little, if any, engagements with other Muslims in the West, and for those who have come to the West, and then of course Muslims now, or the Hizmet's followers now struggle with finding Muslim allies in Erdogan's persecution as a result of this. Of course, and perhaps then, therefore, in the West, because they were focused on majority Turkish population, there's a necessity now to increase efforts of dialogue, both with Muslims and non-Muslims.
On that, I might say that what's interesting is Hizmet diversifies far better when it is based in a polity where there are far few Turks to start to begin with. So the Turkish community, the Turkish diaspora, acts as petrol dollars, as petrol does for the Middle East and for Saudi Arabia. The lack of diversification into other industries in the Middle East is partly explained by the fact that they have this ready resource of oil and natural resources that provide them with what is referred to as the petrol, and so they rely on that. Similarly, when Hizmet has gone into a particular locality or a particular polity, where there's a ready-made Turkish diaspora, that relies on the Turkish diaspora to support it, and as a result, it creates this vicious circle. In some ways, it's not vicious, I guess, but it's a sort of a perpetuation of serving the community that supports you, and that reinforces this Turkishness. But the point that you made about Turkishness is at the beginning, if you permit me to elaborate on that, that is a significant issue. It's not just about that; it's also about the obsession with Turkey. And that is a big problem, and that has prevented Hizmet's diversification into wider society, and that is a significant limitation in terms of Hizmet's ability to counter violent extremism, because it hasn't come out of that Turkishness sufficiently. It hasn't diversified its participants within other non-Turkish speaking societies and communities. It is, it is in the Muslim world, in many parts of the Muslim world, but in the diaspora, especially in the West, and that's the context from which we're speaking, it hasn't achieved that. So that I think is a significant issue. And as you point out, of course, another is that not engaging with other Muslim groups here, and that was partly out of a sensitivity to avoid angering the Kemalist Turkish establishment, because they have various issues to do with various other Islamic groups. But it was a misplaced sensitivity, and again, that leads to that. But another thing, Aisha, is not being comfortable and open with it in terms of its religiousness. Hizmet has always sort of pushed the religiosity of Hizmet to the background, and it did this out of good intentions. It wanted to be inclusive. This is why I call it a faith inspired in motivation, yet faith neutral in manifestation. I often talk about it like that, because it wants to bring people of different backgrounds, different religions, and it wants to serve people regardless of their religious belief, and that's an thing. But it's really important that you make it clear what your point of inspiration is from. I mean, the people that you're serving have a right to know that, okay? If I sent my child to any school and that school had a religious underpinning, I'd want to know it. It doesn't matter that it doesn't affect the curriculum. I'd want to be informed by that. I'd probably still send my child there, but it's something that we should do. And pushing your religiousness to the background, I think in Turkey was understandable, because pious Muslims were persecuted by the Kemalist regime for decades, which in part explains the AKP phenomenon that we have. But it's far less understandable in the West, and we need to be far more confident with this. And that is also why this whole issue about avoiding confrontation, this is another problematic area. I mean, how do you deal with Islamophobia and Puritanical Islamist extremism if you're unwilling to be controversial? You need to be controversial with somebody, right? You can't be good, and you can't just, otherwise there's just no excitement to what it is that you're saying. You need to be clearer about it. that doesn't mean that Hizmet stops being indirect in its activities, and that it does practices that produce these unintended outcomes. It can and it should, but it needs to be more confident in that. And that in some part is also about being confident in your religious identity. So yeah, those are all. But one of the things that perhaps you were going to get onto, but I cut you off there, sorry, I should. But one of the significant things that I think it's really important to mention is, of course, Hizmet engaged in a double talk. And I think it's important that participants within Hizmet acknowledge this. So Hizmet said that we're entirely civil society movement. We're focused on education, on dialogue. We're not about being political. We don't have political desires and so forth. But it's for this or that reason, and we can talk about this as a broader topic, but for this or that reason, Hizmet did engage in an effort to embed itself within certain aspects or certain parts of the Hizmet movement did engage in efforts to embed itself within the state. And it did engage within efforts to influence the political discourse in Turkey, right? And that double talk is deeply problematic, because for the social movement, one of the key things is trust. And so when you engage in a double talk, when you do something, where there's a conflict between what you're doings and your sayings, then you lose the moral high ground, and you undermine the trust in yourself, and obviously you become a political actor in the way that Hizmet did, and what it did was it aligned itself for a period of time with the AKP. Now, we can talk about the contextual forces, why it did that, and so forth. But ultimately, from an ethical point of view, we need to be able to say whether that was right or whether it was wrong in terms of its own principles, and whether it was right and wrong in terms of its strategic aims. And the social movement's number one strategic aim must be to preserve its integrity, must be to preserve the moral high ground, and to preserve trust. And so what that has resulted in, as we can see, is it's created distrust, and it's undermined trust in Islam. So that, I think, is, and that expands beyond Turkey, and it comes into the diaspora as well. But this is a more complex topic that perhaps we need to discuss if you want to.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are two things I've just made notes whilst you were talking. But just on the last comment you made, I mean, if we look at Gülen's life, I mean, the movement, the Hizmet movement has recently become, I think hated is an understatement, but hated movement in Turkish context. Gülen, I think we could comfortably say to a large extent by the bureaucracy in Turkey, was never liked. And I think we need to look at the movement and Gülen as two separate entities when we're discussing, the Turkish context and how both acted. Because I mean, Gülen's initial early, when he was still back in Turkey, court orders and cases against him were on this issue of whether he was an Islamist actor trying to overtake the state. And when Gülen was kind of asked at later dates about Muslims participating in the civil service, for example, he said, that there is no issue with someone who, is pious taking a role in civil society or civil practice. But from a Turkish perspective, that comment alone is so loaded and so problematic that, well, what do you mean? If it is, I mean, in the West we call it public servant.
Yeah.
In Turkey, it's
kamu görevlisi, devlet görevlisi. Yeah, so you're.
Yeah, no, that was the dichotomy that I wanted to. So in the West, you're a servant of the public, but you're a servant of the state, and the state and religion and these dichotomies, I think in itself, it kind of really enriched the debate, and there's a lot of discourse going on, but for Gülen to say, there was never an issue, but then clearly there was an issue, because you got called to court for comments you made in this regard, and then you had to leave the country, as evidently, I mean,
look, let's out. Yeah, sorry.
So I think that's kind of one thing that we can come back into to discuss as well. But also on, in you mentioned transparency, which I agree. I went to a Church of England school, and that wasn't an issue for me. I turned out who I am today, hopefully identifying Muslim, at least. But you know, as you said, for a Gulen inspired school to not say this and then to go on to and have the lack of transparency is extremely problematic, both in schools or other organizations that the movement holds, because you're going into a space, you need to have that sense of trust. I'm wondering if, because the members of the movement who initially came to the West were coming from this Kemalist background, did they have a lack of understanding of the openness in the West? I mean, if you go into a church, as many dialogue volunteers do, and you start discussing the ideas and thoughts of Gulen, no one's going to criticize you, okay? No one's going to follow you. No one's going to, you know, be a troll for you. No one's going to report you to the police for doing such. But in Turkey, even prior to the coup, you know, in areas of society, you couldn't do that. So I'm wondering if it was that fear that was just transferred, a lack of understanding of society here in the West, that people had that fear and fear of and lack of transparency.
Oh, look, Aisha, there's two things there. I mean, if you create a mechanism, a state, a space, right, a public space that discriminates people by their faith, their religion, their sexuality, you have the ethical right to overcome that, to struggle to overcome that. There's no logic to that discrimination that holds water. So, you know, the Kemalist regime created a state structure that discriminated against, profiled, attempted to control pious Islam and Muslimness in Turkey for many decades.
Or not, perhaps we could say non-Turkish Sunni Muslims, you know.
Yeah. So the idea there is it's not just the religiosity, but, you know, so if you're Alevi, so if you're not Sunni, then you're discriminated against. If you're Kurdish rather than Turkish ethnically, then you're discriminated against. If you hold any other political ideology other than Kemalism, then you're discriminated against. If you're a Sunni Muslim and Turkish, then you're fine. But if you're practicing, so they don't want you to be a practicing observant Sunni Muslim, then again you're discriminated against. And, you know, so I get the idea. There's no, you know, so if there are barriers in your way and those barriers have no meritocracy behind them, there's no reasonable explanation for them to be the way they are, that's discrimination. And so you have a right to overcome that discrimination. And I said it once, you know, if you, in Iran, being a homosexual is a crime. So if you apply for a job in Iran and you happen to be a homosexual, you can be excused for not volunteering that information, you know, to whoever it is that you're applying for the job, because you would be criminalized for it and you'd be punished for it. So you can hide that, and that's fine. And I don't have an issue with that. I think that people of all religious persuasion, ethnic background, sexual orientation have a right to be judges and civil servants and prosecutors and whatever in Turkey, in the Turkish context. And the very fact that the Kemalist regime created this overbearing, overwhelming, controlling, micromanaging state structure created this need to protect yourself. I call it the persecuted group syndrome. If you're a group in Turkey or any other part of the world and you're persecuted by the state, one way that you try to prevent that persecution is to embed yourself within the state. So there's explanations. And Nick Ashdown, who's a Canadian journalist, he gave this example, which I also thought of, and it sort of coheres with this. He says, God forbid if you ever fall into the US, into the US penitentiary system, into the prison in the US, because there's a disproportionate number of guards vis-a-vis prisoners. If you're ever in that system there in prison, you need to protect yourself. And how do you do that? Well, there are groups there, right? So you join a particular group to protect yourself because the system doesn't protect you. And it's the same thing in Turkey. The lack of meritocracy, the fact that it's all about who you know, means that, and the fact that this is an overbearing, overarching, overwhelming, all-powerful, micromanaging state that persecutes others, it creates this desire to protect yourself within it, to get within it, and so forth. Then you have the right to. Why not? The problems, Aisha, occurs when it goes beyond that, and you start to organize among yourselves. Now, this is normal in Turkey state structures. That's how it is right now, you know, and that's how it has always been in modern Turkish history. But it's something that the movement should not have partaken in, right? And that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's exceptional to Hizmet. It's not. I'm not saying the entirety of the Hizmet movement did it. I'm not. I'm not saying that all public servants in Turkey did that. I'm not. But I'm saying that this is something that did happen, clearly. And it happens because once you, Pierre Bourdieu talks about habitus. He says, when you engage in a certain field, you know, whether it's going to the shop and buying something, or whether you're doing something at university, or you're working somewhere, whenever you engage in a particular field, whether it's economic, social, political, or otherwise, you internalize the habitus of that field. And the habitus is the mindset and the culture of that field. And so what you have is, when you have so many people within the Hizmet movement, within this Turkish state structure, unknowingly, they've internalized the state mindset, right? And that, from a civil society social movement point of view, is problematic, because we're supposed to be countering that. We're supposed to be providing, you know, a projection of the blind spot of the state. You know, we're supposed to say, you know, for example, this is quite a deep conversation, so I don't want to disrespect the time limits that you've put. So maybe we can discuss this further. But that is an issue. But on the other point that you said, when people are so afraid of being open about their identity, and then they leave that country, it takes them a while. Of course, it takes them a while, to unlearn that practice and to move away from that. Of course, that happens. But you know, 15, 20 years should be enough, and you know, we should be making more effort, I think, in that respect, because otherwise change then never comes, right? And we have to remember that the movement is impatient when it comes to doing anything else. So when we say let's open schools, the movement is impatient. Let's just do it without thinking it, right? With dialogue organizations, it's impatient. So you never hear the movement being, you know, referring to the sociological challenges of change and development and this, when it comes to these projects that the movement genuinely desires to do. But when we open this topic of change in relation to the movement's mindset, automatically everyone within the movement, and especially the status quo holders, start to become some of the most understanding, sympathetic people who refer to sociology and psychology and how difficult it is to change. I'm not necessarily asking, who am I to ask, but I'm not necessarily saying that the movement needs to change. What I'm drawing attention perhaps to is the lack of effort for change. You know, we need to show effort, and if we don't show effort, then perhaps the change won't come, you know.
Perhaps that effort should come first through a better understanding of prior mistakes. I'll just go straight on to our questions. I'm going to link two which are very similar and short, and then we have a larger question. So the first one starts with, would you say the Hizmet ideology is the best solution to radicalization? And then I'll just add another question to that, another layer. How do you interpret some Muslim youth is born and bred in Western countries, including the UK, to have sympathy for extremist ideology and being hostile to their home country? So perhaps starting with that and then going back to...
I don't say it's the best. I think the literature on violent extremism tells us that there are multiple pathways to violent extremism. So we need multiple solutions. So there's no single way. You can't just say that this is the way to solve it, because there's multiple pathways. So you need multiple prevention attempts. So I wouldn't say it's the best. It's one of. And the other thing that I'm saying is that you need direct approaches. You also need indirect approaches. So I'm trying to draw attention to the unintended outcomes of unrelated practices. So we are all, as human beings, as the way that our mind is wired, we sort of associate two things together if they look alike or sound alike. So if there's an organization that claims that it's challenging violent extremism, and this is the big topic of the day, then, you know, we put those two things together and we say that is doing that, and we focus our energy, and they're making the noise, right? And they've got a point. So I'm not saying that they should be excluded, of course, but while we focus on the people that are talking about the conversation, what about the people that are saying something about this conversation, but they're not verbalizing it, right? Saying it in the way that we recognize. And this comes back to Western knowledge production. You know, in the West, we understand the way there's a certain form of knowledge production, and that is, you know, publishing articles in journals, you know, speaking at conferences. There's a certain nature of conventional forms of knowledge production in the West, and it's very literal, it's very textual. What about other forms of knowledge retention and production outside of the West? So where that form of knowledge is not produced and perpetuated in the text, but it's produced and perpetuated perhaps in stories, produced and perpetuated perhaps in plays, produced and perpetuated perhaps in other forms of practice. So we need to be able to see that. And that's the point I'm trying to draw attention to. And also The point is, de-radicalization, as I say, is a small group of people. We should focus on them. But the vast majority of people are not radical. Why did they not become radical? So if there's a lesson to learn from former extremists about de-radicalization, there is a much bigger lesson to learn from people that never became radicalized, despite facing similar situations in their youth, such as I did. And there's a bigger lesson to learn there. And as I said, you know, I remember one of the people from these organizations, one of the famous, you know, organizations, well, known organizations in the UK, he came up to me and said, how do you inspire people? This is one of the problems that we have. We can't inspire people. And, you know, social movements, Islamic social movements that don't aim to just de-radicalize, that have a broader aim, perhaps, are perhaps better placed at this understanding of inspiration and so forth. So, you know, I wouldn't say it's best. I say it is an example of producing a form of practice that undermines radical extremist ideology and propensity without advertising it. I think we need to look at that more. And as I said, the FCO, the British government, is now doing that. In terms of what the second question was, why do British Muslims look, complex. It's complex, you know, it's not one thing. I mean, I gave an example from my own story. I went through an identity crisis. I didn't know who I was. I felt challenged by what I was seeing. I felt challenged by my emotions towards it. You know, I felt that I liked what I saw. And I thought, well, you know, how can I like this? And then I looked at the literature on Islam and I didn't see anything there about democracy. I couldn't connect that. And this is as a 14, 15-year-old. So, and then my my parents' Islam was traditional. It wasn't textual. It wasn't, you know, it didn't resonate with me. And so I was, you know, so for me, that's what it was. And a charismatic recruiter would have had his time with me. So for some, it's that. For others, it's other things. This is not a simple phenomenon. Human beings are very complex. And one of the problems with studying this is, especially studying the prevention of radicalization, is how do you measure a negative impact? It didn't happen. So, you know, how do you measure that, right? Number two, how do you measure radicalization? Ideally, as a researcher, you want to measure it and study it while it's happening, right? But often the way we measure it and study it is after it has happened. You meet the person. So one of the ways is to speak to somebody whom you consider to be radicalized, and you ask them, you interview them. But there's vast problems there, massive problems, because even if that person is honest, and he may not be or she may not be, but even if they are, and in many cases they are interpreting their experiences for you. They're justifying their experiences for you. Doesn't mean, and this is why the whole thing about ideology gets all confused. We think that radicalization is all about ideology. Actually, you know, more recent literature tells us that ideology is not the main driver. It's enables. It enables people to collect their emotional trauma, their political ideologies, and project it in an altruistic, justifiable manner. Islam as a religion allows them to do that. And this comes back to the whole thing that we spoke at the beginning about puritanical Islamist extremists. And the reason why we use that term is they conflate ontological absolutism. So belief in one God. We can have a dogmatic view about belief in one God, and that's understandable. At the ontological level, everyone's belief is dogmatic. But what they do is they take that and they turn that into epistemological absolutism. So they say, I believe in one God, absolutely. And I believe that I absolutely have the knowledge of that God. And I know what that God wants from me. And I have absolute knowledge of that. That's where you run into, you know, really significant problems. And that seems to be the sort of the thing that they have. And that can appeal to people. That kind of clarity can appeal to people, but it's not straightforward. One of the things Khalid Abu al-Fadl refers to is, you know, you get a lot of people, not all, I'm not suggesting all of them, but you get this from the natural sciences, people that have studied maths and chemistry and biology, the sciences that provide you with a certain certainty, right? And people that go from that to religion are, you know, really methodologically and epistemologically speaking, they're really playing with fire, because they take everything that they've learned in the natural sciences, which has this emphasis on empiricism, on certainty, on controlling the variables. It's a positivistic science in many ways, right? And they apply that to religion. So they want to eliminate the gray area. Well, actually, you know, when you try to do that, this notion of arriving at certainty. Why do they want that kind of certainty? Well, you need certainty when you're about to encourage people to kill themselves. You can't really say, look, brother, do this, and who knows, you know, you might go to hell, you might go to heaven. It doesn't work that way. You need to provide people with certainty. And it's easier for people who have an engineering background. I don't mean to, you know, disrespect all engineers, but you know, that kind of background to come into religion becomes a really problematic concoction. And as I say, we're complex. There's no one answer to this. This is not unique to Muslims, right? And we're seeing that now with the far right and the extremism. I mean, look what happened in Canada with the Islamophobic attack. I think that's now confirmed that it was a terrorist attack by an Islamophobe that killed 3 generations of a family by driving his truck over them, the Afzal family. Or the Christchurch attack that happened in New Zealand, where I think 51 or 52 Muslims were killed worshipping in a mosque, right? This is not unique to Muslims. This is a part of the human problem.
I mean, there were several elements of that answer that I would like to unpick, but due to the time, I'm just going on to the next. But it reminded me of Talal Assad's understanding of Islam within the secular and the plurality there. So we'll just take this as our final question. That is the last question in the chat section.
I've got child duties as well. I've got to put...
Great. So you say Hizmet's success encountering extremism limited by a number of shortcomings. The most significant is its core identifier, Turkishness. You also on other Islamic movements. Do you see Hizmet working with these movements in the future to transcend this obvious cultural baggage?
Yeah, I do. I hope. I think it will. So the Turkey's persecution of Hizmet didn't cause Hizmet's problems. Hizmet had inherent problems. Anything that is problematic, right? I mean, I hope this is not a revelation to anyone. Any human construct, and Hizmet is a human construct. It has its problems, it has its flaws, and you know, it needs to be constantly updated and renewed and developed. And even with all the effort that you make and put into it, like with anything else, there will be problems and shortcomings, and Hizmet has that as well. But the Turkey's persecution has sort of helped, I think, in some ways, because it's now created an emotional break with Turkey and with Turkishness. A lot of people in Hizmet that have been persecuted by the Turkish state feel offended that, and I think rightfully so in many respects, that the Turkish public was so supportive of that in some ways, and you know, and enabled it and legitimized it, and you know, accepted it and said it was, you know, correct. And you know, the parallels between Turkey now and the 1930s, the late 1930s, with the dehumanization of the Jews are very, very strikingly similar. So there's been an emotional break with Turkey and with Turkishness, and this whole thing that, you know, the Turkish people are so wonderful and so forth. No, Turkish people are human, and they are, as any other human collectivity, flawed, and we've seen that. So hopefully that has created a break. Also, Turks and the Turkish diaspora abroad are now keeping their distance. So this is now where Hizmet is sort of heavily and was heavily invested in the Turkish diaspora. It will now have to, and is having to now, diversify its base if it wants to continue giving something to society. So you're now seeing a greater interaction with other British Muslims and other Muslims alike. And the other thing is that one of the reasons why Hizmet kept its distance from other British Muslims is not British Muslims, but other Muslim groups, was the idea that, you know, somehow it had its own problems. It had its own accusations to deal with, and associating with other groups who were also being accused of other things, you know, rightfully, wrongfully, mostly wrongfully. You know, Hizmet didn't want to engage in the process of having to also defend that. And also because Hizmet has scores in all parts of the world. So if you engage with the Muslim Brotherhood in one part of the world and there's a state that has declared it a terrorist group, then, you know, what do you do? So, you know, there's that. But there's also ideological problems with political Islamists in particular. But now that Hizmet has been accused of almost everything, I think that's broken that sensitivity that was misplaced to begin with. So Hizmet now needs to decide on what basis is it going to engage with other groups. So it needs to have a principle-based approach, not a pragmatist-based approach. Hizmet is first and foremost an idealistic collectivity, right? Like most social Islamic groups, it has an idealistic notion. And you have a real problem when you bring that together with pragmatism. So you've got to let go of pragmatism and populism in that sense, and look at your principles. What are the principles? On what basis do you want to engage with other Muslim groups? So Hizmet is doing that. In the past, Hizmet had begun to invite more Muslim speakers, more Muslim representatives. It did do that. You know, I don't want to be unfair. There are many dialogue organizations, many Hizmet organizations that did that, but it kept its distance, if you like, at the organizational level. And I think that's now breaking down, and I think that's a useful thing, because there's a lot that Hizmet needs to learn from other Muslims in other parts of the world, but also vice versa. There's also a lot that we can give and should be giving, and there is that interaction that needs to ensue, I think.
Well, I would add on to that, but I'm not. I'm going to be. I am usually religiously strict with the time, but we started a little late. We're ending a little late, so hopefully, and our viewers are still here with us. So hopefully, it was been enjoyable, intellectually stimulating discussion for our viewers. It was for me, and it was a pleasure to share this platform with you. So thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me, and I apologize if anything that I've said has offended anybody in any way. Sometimes you say things and people misunderstand, or you just misrepresent yourself, or you said something that is worthwhile being offended by. So if any of those occurrences or situations have come about, I'm sorry for that. But this is a fascinating discussion that needs to be that needs further exploration. Let's put it that way. And for that we need time, which we don't currently have.
Okay. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Likewise.